Imagine riding 100 miles through blizzards, bandits, and brutal terrain just to deliver a letter. That was reality for Pony Express riders who risked death every day to keep the country connected. But these daring messengers weren't the first to face such danger. Long before them, ancient Persian couriers ran across deserts and mountains. Roman imperial spies carried secrets on horseback, and early airmail pilots flew flimsy planes through storms, sometimes paying the ultimate price. Between 1918 and 1926 alone, 35 pilots lost their lives just delivering mail. The story of mail delivery is filled with risk, grit, and a surprising amount of ingenuity. If you think your daily commute is tough, wait until you hear what these early mail carriers went through. Long before express mail or overnight shipping, the Persian Empire relied on a system that was nothing short of revolutionary. Stretching from Egypt to India, the empire's vastness demanded more than just local messengers. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus the Great set up what historians consider the world's first organized courier network, an innovation that would shape global communication for centuries. These couriers, known as pirradaziš, weren't just ordinary messengers. They were skilled horsemen, often recruited from mountain tribes, famed for their stamina and riding ability. The backbone of their system was the Royal Road, a highway of sorts running nearly 2,600 kilometers from Susa to Sardis. But this was only one of many such routes crisscrossing the empire, each designed to carry vital news with astonishing speed. Relay stations, called chaparkane, were built every 14 to 20 miles along these roads. At each stop, a fresh rider and horse awaited, ready to take the message onward. Riders switched at roughly 15-mile relays, enabling non-stop delivery speeds unmatched until the 19th century. Herodotus, the Greek historian, famously marveled, "Neither snow nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Thanks to this relentless relay, a message could travel the 600 miles from Susa to Sardis in just 7 to 9 days, an average of more than 170 miles per day. But the system's efficiency came at a steep price. The routes cut through some of the harshest terrain in the ancient world. Couriers braved the freezing peaks of the Zagros Mountains, where wolves prowled the passes. In the Dasht-e-Kavir desert, dehydration was a constant threat. There was little shade and even less water. Sandstorms could appear without warning, forcing riders to wrap their faces in wet wool for protection, an early version of the desert scarf still used today. Between way stations, riders were on their own, relying on speed and skill to survive. Bandits were another danger. Trade routes attracted thieves who knew that Persian couriers sometimes carried more than just letters. Messages, orders, and, at times, small valuables for the court made them tempting targets. Riders armed themselves with short swords called akanakis, but heavy armor was out of the question. It would only slow them down. Survival depended on quick reflexes and the ability to vanish into the landscape if trouble appeared. The Persian postal system was more than just fast. It was meticulously organized. The main job of the couriers was to carry royal decrees, administrative orders, and intelligence reports. Messages were written on clay tablets or folded and sealed letters, most often in Aramaic, the empire's official administrative language. Some letters were even formatted to a standard, with seals ensuring authenticity. If a message was urgent, the emperor himself might add a warning. If you value your position, send tribute without delay. Delays could mean demotion, punishment, or worse, not just for the courier, but for the recipient as well. Every stop along the way was carefully managed. Station masters kept detailed records, tracking the arrival and departure of messengers, the condition of the horses, and even how much fodder each animal consumed. Archaeologists have found clay tablets from Persepolis that list the names of couriers, their routes, and the supplies they received. This level of accountability made the Persian system so reliable that even foreign mercenaries, like the Greeks hired by Persian princes, used it to send news home. Xenophon, a Greek historian and soldier, described how messengers navigated dangerous mountain passes, sometimes even when the enemy controlled the high ground. Weather was always a formidable adversary. In the Mesopotamian plains, summer temperatures soared above 120 degrees. Winter brought snow and ice to the mountains, blocking passes and forcing couriers to find alternate routes. Riders learned to follow the stars at night, or look for signal fires lit by station keepers to stay on course. If disaster struck, there was little hope of rescue. Speed was their only defense. The Persian system's reach was astonishing. It was not limited to the royal road. Messages traveled to and from distant regions like Egypt, India, and even the Greek city of Ephesus. The network's efficiency was so renowned that later empires took notice. Manuals on postal logistics in medieval Europe and China drew inspiration from the Persian relay, adapting its principles to their own needs. Artifacts help us picture these ancient messengers. A lapis lazuli cylinder seal from Persepolis shows a courier handing a scroll to a scribe. The muscular legs and tense posture of the rider hint at the physical demands of the job. Archaeologists have found similar seals at over 20 stations, suggesting they served as royal authorization badges. Losing one meant facing the king's inspectors, a prospect no courier wanted to imagine. Stories about Persian couriers spread far beyond the empire's borders. Steppe nomads told tales of messengers who could outrun arrows shot as warning signals across valleys. One legend described a courier surviving a week in the desert by drinking water from his horse's supply bag, a desperate measure, but one grounded in the realities of ancient travel. Such feats became the stuff of legend, and the reputation of Persian couriers grew with each retelling. The system's reliability became proverbial. Talmudic references from 200 CE compared swift judgment to the post of the Persian kings. When Islamic caliphs revived the vast postal network in the 8th century, they kept the original Persian name, Barid, for their own service. Even Napoleon, centuries later, studied Persian courier logistics to improve his military communications. But the cost of such efficiency was often measured in human lives. Burn marks on the walls of excavated stations suggest some were destroyed during revolts, with messengers caught inside. A cuneiform letter from Babylon records a courier's family petitioning for compensation after he vanished near the Armenian frontier. The official response: let his son take his place. This was not a job for the faint-hearted. Most couriers began their training at just 14 or 16, learning to ride, shoot, and sleep in shifts. Those who survived into their 30s often became station masters, their bodies marked by old wounds and the harshness of the road. Modern experiments revealed just how remarkable these couriers were. In 1971, a test runner on the original 2,600-kilometer Royal Road managed just 50% of the distance before collapsing from exhaustion. His core temperature soared to 106 degrees before he was rescued, underscoring the extreme physical demands faced by ancient messengers. The legacy of the Persian postal system runs deeper than most people realize. The English word post comes from the Latin posita, referring to the placed stations of Rome's own courier network, a system directly inspired by Persia's relay roads. Even the wing symbol used by the Pony Express in the American West echoes the iconography of Persian couriers, who are often depicted with wings to symbolize their speed and divine mission. One final piece of evidence comes from a surprising source: Babylonian astronomy tablets. Scholars recently discovered that Persian couriers were required to report weather conditions, such as sandstorm frequencies and river levels. These reports became the earliest known systematic climate records, preserved not for science, but because the postal administration demanded precision in every detail, even if it meant risking lives to gather the data. As the Persian Empire set the standard for speed, organization, and endurance, future empires would look to their example when building their own networks. Yet, as impressive as Persian couriers were, the next great empire would take the idea of a messenger and transform it into something far more secretive and far more powerful. The Roman Empire set a new standard for communication, turning its couriers into the backbone of an empire that stretched from Britain to the Middle East. By around 20 BCE, Augustus introduced the cursus publicus, an official postal network that ran along more than 250,000 miles of roads. This wasn't just about getting messages from point A to point B. Roman couriers became the unseen eyes and ears of the state, trusted with secrets and tasked with keeping the emperor informed and in control. These riders weren't delivering birthday cards or friendly notes. Instead, they carried sealed imperial dispatches, often protected by a wax seal that only the emperor or his top officials could break. Anyone caught tampering with these messages faced severe consequences. Punishment ranged from harsh forced labor to execution, depending on the crime. The system was designed for both speed and security. Relay stations, sometimes just a few miles apart, dotted the Roman road network, each stocked with fresh horses and guarded by soldiers. A determined courier could cover more than 170 miles in a single day and night, a pace that would remain unmatched in Europe for centuries. The cursus publicus was more than just a mail service. It was a tool of imperial surveillance. Couriers carried diplomata, bronze travel passes that acted as both credentials and orders for cooperation. In one dig in Bavaria, archaeologists discovered a diplomata from 107 CE, instructing local officials to provide food, lodging, and any intelligence requested to the bearer. Other passes included orders for the immediate arrest of anyone named in attached scrolls. This dual role, messenger and spy, earned the system a notorious reputation. Early Christians, for example, called it the cursus diaboli, or the devil's postal service, because it was often used to track and suppress dissent. Imperial couriers enforced the law, and intercepting a sealed dispatch could be considered treason. Roman law was clear. Anyone caught stealing or tampering with imperial mail could face capital punishment. The most sensitive deliveries were handled by trusted agents who sometimes doubled as investigators. The frumentarii, a group of soldiers turned couriers, patrolled the roads, monitored conversations in inns, and reported suspicious activity. Roman historian Suetonius wrote that these couriers could smell treason like hounds. And it wasn't just talk. In 185 CE, a letter intercepted between two senators criticizing Emperor Commodus led to both men being forced to take their own lives, proof that the system's reach was as deadly as it was efficient. Speed was everything for the Romans. When Boudicca's rebellion erupted in Britain in 60 CE, news reached Rome within 5 days. that allowed Emperor Nero to respond before the revolt could spread further. The relay stations, spaced every 8 to 12 miles, allowed for a constant flow of information. At each stop, couriers would switch to a fresh horse, hand off the message to a new rider, or quickly rest and resupply. The roads themselves, some paved, some gravel, all meticulously maintained, were a marvel of engineering, built to withstand the pounding hooves of horses and the weight of imperial carts. But even the best system faced challenges. Volcanic eruptions or wars often disrupted mail routes. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, deliveries to Rome took days longer as couriers navigated blocked roads and ash-choked skies. Winter storms in the Alps posed another hazard. Couriers crossing the mountains wore spiked boots for traction and tied themselves together with ropes to avoid falling into crevasses. Archaeologists once discovered a wrecked mail cart in the Brenner Pass, containing a frozen messenger still clutching a scroll case. Carbon dating placed the tragedy during the brutal winter of 270 CE. Failure was not taken lightly. The Theodosian Code, a collection of Roman laws, reveals just how seriously the empire treated its postal system. A law from 386 CE stated that any courier who lost a message had to replace it within 24 hours or face damnatio ad metalla, forced labor in the harsh Spanish silver mines. Another decree from 408 CE required provincial governors to personally verify all message receipts, on penalty of forfeiting a year's salary if anything went missing. Bandit attacks were a constant threat. The roads were long, and remote sections gave robbers plenty of opportunities. Near Pompeii, a tombstone honors Marcus Aemilius, a courier who killed 7 attackers near Capua. Roman law responded with severity. Bandits caught with stolen imperial mail could be executed. Tactics evolved to match the threat. Archaeologists in Bulgaria found a 4th century mail cart with hidden compartments under false floors, designed to protect high-value dispatches from thieves. The cursus publicus didn't just disappear when the Western Roman Empire fell. In the East, Byzantine emperors upgraded the system. Justinian's agents in the 500s CE even experimented with carrier pigeons for urgent messages. Some birds were trained to fly up to 180 miles non-stop from Antioch to Constantinople. Manuals from the period include instructions for handlers to attach tiny lead pellets to intercepted messages, making enemy birds too heavy to fly home. A clever, if slightly sneaky, security measure. When the Arabs captured Egypt in 642 CE, they found intact Roman postal stations, complete with maps of military roads and instructions for managing routes. Caliph Muawiyah adapted the system for his own empire, creating the Barid, a postal network that borrowed heavily from Roman methods, including the use of couriers as spies. One Umayyad document from 689 CE even boasts about riders who could detect a plot by reading the wrinkles in a courier's brow, a nod to Roman training in facial recognition and observation. The legacy of the cursus publicus lasted even longer in Western Europe. Charlemagne tried to revive the system in the early 800s, but his inspectors quickly realized their own riders couldn't match the speed of the old Roman couriers. One monk in Aachen complained that Frankish messengers took 3 days to cover a distance Romans managed in a single day. The answer? Higher Lombard couriers trained in the Byzantine style, who still used Roman hand signals to identify themselves at night. Physical traces of the network still surface. In 2016, archaeologists using LiDAR uncovered a buried relay station in Serbia, complete with horse stalls and preserved feed troughs. Analysis of the manure revealed that the horses ate imported Egyptian grain, evidence of the empire's far-reaching supply chains. Some imperial postal stations also kept detailed records of river levels and weather to help plan routes, providing some of the earliest known climate data in history. Artifacts tell us more about the lives and dangers of these couriers. In the Naples Archaeological Museum, a speculum, or bronze mirror, once belonged to a senior courier. The back is inscribed with instructions for detecting counterfeit travel passes by checking the reflectivity of the wax seal. Historians believe it doubled as a discreet tool for self-defense, a reminder that even trusted messengers needed to watch their backs. The risks were real. A mass grave near Trier, Germany, holds the skeletons of 17 couriers killed during a barbarian raid in 355 CE. Forensic analysis showed identical stab wounds to the right shoulder, suggesting they were attacked while reaching for their swords on horseback. Their graves contained miniature led horses, tokens of a profession where every ride could be the last. Despite the dangers, the Roman postal system shaped the world for centuries. Its influence stretched from the Byzantine Empire to the Islamic caliphates, and even inspired later European rulers. The idea of using organized communication networks for both trade and intelligence would echo through history, setting the stage for the next wave of messengers, those who risked everything not for emperors, but for commerce. As medieval Europe's markets and trade routes expanded, a new kind of postal network began to take shape, not run by kings or popes, but by the merchants themselves. With commerce stretching from the Italian city-states to the fairs of northern France and beyond, reliable communication became essential for business. State-run posts were slow and focused mainly on royal or religious correspondence, so merchants took matters into their own hands, building private systems that connected cities, ports, and even distant continents. Italian merchant corporations led the way, especially those from Florence, Genoa, and Siena. These cities forged intricate connections with the Champagne fairs in France, which acted as major gathering points for traders from across Europe. To keep their businesses running smoothly, merchants established relay stations along key routes, such as the road from Florence to Troyes. At each station, fresh horses and supplies awaited, and couriers often traveled in groups for safety. Strict rules governed every aspect of the system, from how letters were accepted and paid for to the schedules couriers followed, and even the hostels where they could rest between legs of the journey. The Venetian network was especially ambitious. Merchants from Venice not only linked up with inland trade fairs, but also maintained a regular connection to Constantinople, more than 1,000 miles away. By the early 14th century, the Venetian system was so well respected that the King of Persia granted Venetian couriers safe passage through his lands, a sign of just how vital these communications had become for international trade. These messengers carried bills of exchange, contracts, and news about market conditions, all carefully protected in sturdy chests or oilcloth-wrapped satchels. Travel was dangerous. Couriers faced all the classic hazards of the Middle Ages: bandits lurking in forests, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of political unrest. To reduce the risk, some merchant networks stationed armed guards at key relay points. Account books from the era record expenses for stable boys and security, as well as the occasional loss of both courier and cargo to storms or attacks. When letters were especially valuable, merchants sometimes used ciphers, simple codes that rendered stolen correspondence useless to anyone without the key. The need for speed and reliability drove innovation. Some networks, like those supporting the Champagne fairs, placed relay stations about every 25 miles, ensuring that fresh horses and rested riders could keep the mail moving day and night. In Russia, the rise of commerce saw the development of regular staging posts where couriers could swap tired horses for fresh ones, helping to push messages across vast and often wild territories. Russian merchants even paid extra for winter service, employing couriers who could navigate frozen rivers on skis to keep trade flowing during the harshest months. The Swiss Stumplebotten, a system of local runners, and the German Metzger Post, where butchers on regular routes carried letters as a sideline, show how creative these merchant networks could be. By piggybacking on existing travel patterns, they kept costs low and coverage wide. The integration of postal services with established trade routes became a practical solution for merchants facing a world where every delay could mean lost profits. Merchants also turned to carrier pigeons, especially in port cities like Genoa and Venice. Birds trained to fly between major hubs carried urgent news or price updates, sometimes arriving faster than any rider could. The cost was high, but so were the stakes. One missed shipment or delayed payment could ruin a business. Records show that pigeons were used for particularly sensitive or time-critical messages, and the system was trusted enough that even shipwrecked letters sometimes turned up, still sealed and legible, after days at sea. Organization was everything. The archives of Francesco Dattini, a Florentine merchant, include more than 140,000 letters, each carefully logged with dates and delivery notes. The fastest journeys could cover hundreds of miles in just over a week, rivaling the speed of state messengers and far outpacing the university or church systems of the same time. The merchant networks were built for efficiency, and their rules reflected the pressures of commerce. Delays were costly, and lost letters could mean lawsuits or ruined reputations. Sometimes, the risks went beyond weather and bandits. During outbreaks of plague, cities like Lübeck suspended all incoming mail from affected regions, paralyzing trade for months. Merchants responded by inventing crude quarantine measures, such as airing letters in vinegar fumes before opening them. These early attempts at disease control reveal just how intertwined communication and public health could become, even in the medieval world. Physical evidence of these systems still turns up in old warehouses and archives. Archaeologists in Bruges discovered a strongbox filled with undelivered letters, their wax seals still intact after centuries. Some letters contained desperate pleas for news or instructions to send goods only if quality met the buyer's standards. The fact that so many letters never reached their destinations is a reminder of just how uncertain communication could be, even with organized networks in place. Merchant posts weren't the only game in town. Monasteries and universities maintained their own messenger systems, sometimes competing with merchants for business. In some cases, religious orders were even forbidden from carrying commercial mail, a sign of how important and lucrative the business of communication had become. Still, merchant networks remained the backbone of international trade, filling the gaps left by slow or unreliable state posts. Technological improvements followed the needs of the time. Waterproof seals, lightweight parchment, and protective cases all emerged to meet the challenges of long-distance travel. Even the humble sandwich, according to some accounts, owes its origins to innkeepers feeding messengers in a hurry, meat and cheese between slices of bread, easy to eat on the go. The merchant postal systems also played a role in spreading literacy and information. As business correspondence became more common, more people learned to read and write, Letters carried not just contracts and invoices, but news, gossip, and ideas. This helped lay the groundwork for the intellectual and cultural changes that would sweep Europe in the centuries to come. Despite their successes, merchant posts eventually gave way to more centralized systems. In the late 15th century, the Thurn and Taxis family secured imperial rights to run Europe's first official postal service, gradually absorbing or outcompeting the older networks. The rise of national posts marked a new era in communication, but the innovations and determination of medieval merchants paved the way. From the bustling markets of Florence to the icy roads of Russia, these early postal networks kept commerce and information moving. They bridged distances, overcame dangers, and connected people in ways that state-run systems simply couldn't match at the time. Their legacy is still visible in the way we think about logistics, communication, and the value of reliable information. By the time the age of exploration dawned and new continents entered the global trading web, the lessons learned from centuries of merchant mail would shape the next great leap in postal history. And as the world changed, so did the people determined to keep its messages moving. One letter, one route, and one risky journey at a time. By the mid-1700s, the American colonies were growing fast, but their mail system was stuck in the past. Letters crawled along muddy roads, sometimes taking weeks to travel between cities like Philadelphia and New York. Into this mess stepped Benjamin Franklin, a printer, publisher, and soon, one of history's greatest postal reformers. When Franklin became Philadelphia's postmaster in 1737, he didn't just see a job. He saw a chance to transform the way people connected. Franklin's first big move was simple but revolutionary. He installed stone milestones along major mail routes, marking distances so riders could track their progress and plan their journeys more efficiently. This small change had a huge impact. Delivery times between Philadelphia and New York dropped from several days to just a day and a half. Boston merchants started receiving replies within 3 weeks instead of waiting months. Franklin's approach was practical. He noticed that riders often lingered too long at taverns, so he introduced strict schedules and penalties for delays. Suddenly, the mail moved faster and more predictably. Efficiency paid off. For the first time, the colonial post office turned mail from a loss into profit. Franklin's business sense was clear. As Philadelphia's postmaster, he wrote that the job facilitated the correspondence that improved my newspaper, increased the number demanded, as well as the advertisements to be inserted, so that it came to afford me a considerable income. As his reputation grew, Franklin was promoted to comptroller of all 13 colonial post offices, overseeing more than 1,500 miles of rough, often dangerous terrain. He managed the finances, tracked postal routes, and made sure that even the most remote settlements stayed connected. Franklin knew that a growing society needed more than just faster letters. It needed a post office designed for the people. He introduced the penny post in major cities, letting anyone have mail delivered directly to their door for just an extra penny. This small fee generated new revenue and made the service more accessible. He also established the dead letter office, a clever fix for undeliverable mail. Instead of letting unclaimed letters pile up, Franklin ordered them opened after 3 months. If money was found inside, it went back to the post office, clearing out the backlog and funding further improvements. Franklin's reforms weren't just about profit. They changed how people lived. With faster mail, sweethearts wrote more often, merchants received orders twice as quickly, and newspapers spread news in record time. Franklin believed in a free and varied press, so he made sure all kinds of newspapers could travel through the mail, not just his own. This helped create a more informed and connected public. As Franklin's influence grew, so did his ambitions. In 1753, he became Joint Deputy Postmaster General for the colonies, working alongside William Hunter. Together, they introduced overnight riders, sometimes called night relays, who rode through the darkness to keep the mail moving. With these innovations, round-trip communication between Philadelphia and New York could happen in just 24 hours, a speed that wouldn't be matched again until the railroad era. To fund these upgrades, Franklin and Hunter borrowed triple their own salaries, betting that the increased volume would cover the costs. Their gamble paid off. Colonial post offices became busier than ever, and the mail became a vital part of daily life. Franklin didn't stop with roads. He studied wind patterns to speed up transatlantic mail ships and designed waterproof mailbags after learning that soaked letters accounted for a third of all delivery failures. He encouraged riders to avoid flooded roads by sticking to higher ground, and those informal detours eventually became permanent routes. Every improvement was rooted in observation and a willingness to experiment. Managing the growing system wasn't easy. Franklin introduced detailed record keeping and required postmasters to account for every penny. He set up clear rules for handling undeliverable mail and made sure that even distant towns received regular deliveries. The system became so reliable that when Franklin's reforms reached Annapolis, post office revenue jumped from £12 to 80c7s in a single month. Faster mail meant people wrote more and paid more for reliable service. Security also mattered, especially as tensions with Britain increased. Wartime mail carried secret dispatches, and Franklin's network relied on sturdy locks and trusted riders to keep information safe. The post office became a tool for both communication and intelligence, shaping how the colonies coordinated during the years leading up to the Revolution. Franklin's reforms had another, less visible side. He borrowed ideas from the great courier networks of the past, but he also introduced new concepts. Standardized postal rates based on weight and distance made the system fairer and easier to use, an idea Britain wouldn't adopt until decades later. He even experimented with homing pigeons for coastal communication, but local hawks quickly ended that project. Not every idea worked, but Franklin's willingness to try new things kept the system evolving. When Franklin joined the Patriots, the British dismissed him as deputy postmaster in 1774. The Royal Mail quickly collapsed in the colonies, and by 1775, Americans set up the Constitutional Post, using Franklin's methods to keep their own communications flowing. Under Franklin's blueprint, the new service became a lifeline for the Revolution. Congress poured money into rebuilding disrupted routes, and George Washington exempted postal riders from military drafts, calling them the nervous system of our cause. Secure mail became essential for moving secret messages and keeping the colonies united. Franklin's influence didn't end with America. While serving as ambassador to France, he helped redesign the French postal system, suggesting that mail be sorted during transit, rather than just at endpoints. This simple change cut delivery times between Paris and Marseille from 6 days to 4. French postmasters also adopted his waterproof bags and milestone systems, spreading Franklin's ideas far beyond the Atlantic. Artifacts from Franklin's era still turn up today. Archaeologists in Boston found a stone mile marker he ordered placed in 1744, with grooves to help riders read the number by touch at night. Nearby, they uncovered a rusted mail lockbox with a design almost identical to modern versions. These remnants show just how lasting Franklin's changes were. Franklin's reforms also shaped the flow of information. He allowed academic journals to be exchanged postage-free, letting scientists and scholars share their discoveries more easily. This early version of interlibrary loan sped up the spread of new ideas and helped American science develop faster. But the system had its dangers. Riders faced broken limbs, snake bites, and even fatal accidents from falling trees. Franklin compensated injured couriers and their families, but he kept the mail moving. His unofficial motto, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat stays these couriers," was more than a boast. It was the expectation. By the time Franklin died, his legacy was clear. 75 post offices and 1,800 miles of postal roads stretched from the Atlantic to Canada, forming the backbone of what would become the United States Postal Service. His reforms made mail faster, more reliable, and accessible to more people than ever before. Franklin proved that communication could bind a scattered nation together, and that a well-run postal system could change the course of history. The need for reliable, rapid mail would only grow as America expanded westward, and soon, new challenges would test just how far and how fast messages could travel. No other mail service in American history captured the national imagination quite like the Pony Express. When it burst onto the scene in April 1860, it offered something no stagecoach or steamship could: a 10-day dash across nearly 2,000 miles of wild country, connecting St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. The masterminds behind it, William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell, saw a chance to bridge the growing gap between East and West at a time when national unity was hanging by a thread. The Pony Express was a bold experiment. The company hired about 80 riders, most of them teenagers weighing under 125 pounds, and paid them $25 a week. An astonishing sum when a common laborer might earn $1 a day. These young men were chosen for their speed, lightweight, and willingness to take risks that most adults would never consider. Each was given a small Bible and asked to sign a pledge promising to avoid swearing, drinking, or fighting. The company's owners hoped this would keep discipline on the trail, but the real test came from the world outside the stations. The route itself was a relentless challenge. From the rolling plains of Nebraska to the jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada, the Pony Express Trail was a patchwork of every kind of hazard the American West could offer. Riders changed horses every 10 to 15 miles at small relay stations, about 190 in all, many of which were little more than log huts or dugouts. The most crucial stops included Salt Lake City, a vital midpoint, and Donner Pass, notorious for its deep winter snows. On a typical shift, a rider would cover 75 to 100 miles before handing off the mochila, a 4-pocket leather mail pouch, to the next courier. That mochila, weighing about 20 pounds fully loaded, was designed to slip over the saddle for a lightning-fast transfer, sometimes in under 2 minutes. Speed was everything, but the price was steep. Riders faced weather extremes that could cripple even the toughest veteran. In the Sierra Nevada, snowdrifts sometimes towered over 20 feet. William Fisher, a rider caught in a January 1861 blizzard, suffered frostbite so severe he lost fingers, but he still managed to finish his run with the mail lashed to his frozen saddle. In the summer, the Nevada desert turned deadly, with daytime temperatures soaring past 120 degrees C. Horses collapsed from heat stroke, and company records show that in July 1860 alone, 16 horses died from the heat. Riders themselves often suffered exhaustion, dehydration, and heat sickness, but the schedule left no time for rest. Danger came from more than just the elements. The Pony Express route cut through territories where bandits and hostile groups posed a constant threat. Some stations, like those near the Carson Sink in Nevada, were attacked during conflicts such as the Pyramid Lake War. At times, entire stations were burned, horses stolen, and employees killed. John Fisher, a station keeper, once survived by hiding under floorboards for 2 days while waiting for help. To protect themselves, station workers built their shelters with thick log walls, few windows, and firing slits instead of open doors. Despite the stories of outlaws and ambushes, not every encounter was hostile. Riders sometimes relied on the goodwill or local knowledge of Native Americans. Shoshone guides, for example, helped lead lost riders through blizzards near South Pass in Wyoming. There were also moments of trade and cooperation. One company ledger notes a payment of blankets to a Shoshone chief for rescuing a stranded courier. Still, tensions ran high, especially in areas where the trail crossed the traditional lands of the Paiute and other groups. The rider's job was to deliver mail, not ask questions. Company rules made it clear no rider could inquire about the contents of the mochila. Secrecy was essential, especially as the country edged closer to civil war. In December 1860, when South Carolina seceded from the Union, it was the Pony Express that carried the news west before telegraph lines could be cut. Critical government dispatches, business contracts, and even personal letters all traveled side by side, their importance known only to the sender and recipient. The physical toll on both riders and equipment was relentless. The specially designed saddles had no stirrups to save weight, which meant riders often developed knee and ankle injuries. Boots wore out every 2 weeks, and company records from 1860 show over 400 pairs ordered to keep up with demand. Horses were the real workhorses of the operation, and the company kept more than 400 animals in constant rotation. Feeding them required a steady stream of supply wagons hauling grain and hay across hundreds of miles of rough country. Navigation was a test of skill and memory. There were no road signs, and much of the trail followed faint tracks or natural landmarks. Riders memorized features like Skull Rock in Wyoming or the river crossings near Fort Bridger. They rode by moonlight, trusting their instincts and their horses. When things went wrong, the results could be tragic. One rider, Warren Upson, vanished near the Carson Sink in 1861. His horse arrived at the next station, mail still strapped to the saddle. But Upson was never seen again. Some riders became legends in their own time. Robert Pony Bob Haslam made a record-breaking 380-mile round trip in just over a day and a half, crossing hostile territory after finding a relay station burned to the ground. Others, like William Buffalo Bill Cody, later claimed to have ridden for the Pony Express, though historians now doubt many of his stories. The real riders, most of them anonymous, were the ones who faced the daily grind and constant risk. Financially, the Pony Express was always on shaky ground. Each letter cost about $5 to send, roughly $150 in today's money, yet the company often charged less to attract business. The government paid for the service as part of a mail contract, but expenses far outstripped revenue. Feeding horses, repairing stations, and paying riders added up to more than $700,000 a year, while postage brought in only a fraction of that. The company's losses were staggering, but the need for rapid communication kept the operation running as long as possible. The end came quickly and decisively. On October 24th, 1861, the transcontinental telegraph line was completed, linking the east and west coasts with near-instant communication. The Pony Express, once the fastest mail service in the country, was suddenly obsolete. The telegraph could send messages across the continent in just 8 hours, a feat no horse could match. Within days, the Pony Express shut down for good, after just 18 months of operation. Many riders finished their final runs to find the stations empty, their jobs gone overnight. Artifacts from the Pony Express era still survive. The National Historic Trail follows much of the original route, and at sites like Cold Spring and South Pass, you can see the remains of old relay stations, their walls etched with graffiti from riders long gone. Museums display battered revolvers, worn saddles, and the rare surviving mochilas, one still stained with the blood of a rider killed in an ambush. Letters carried by the Express are prized collectibles, reminders of a time when speed and courage went hand in hand. The Pony Express proved that Americans would pay almost anything for speed. Its legacy lived on in the systems that followed. The relay model inspired early airmail routes, and the mochila's design influenced the secure diplomatic pouches used today. Even the phrase "pony up" is said to come from the pay disputes of express riders at the end of their runs. The story of the Pony Express is one of grit, ingenuity, and sacrifice, a brief, brilliant chapter in the history of American communication. As the dust settled on the Pony Express, one thing became clear: delivering mail across the continent would always demand new solutions and new kinds of courage. The next great mail route would test drivers in ways even the fastest riders could never have imagined. In 1858, the Butterfield Overland Mail Company set out with one of the most ambitious goals in American history: deliver mail from Missouri to California in less than 25 days, no matter the season. The contract, authorized in March 1857, called for a southern oxbow route that would avoid the deep snows of the Rockies by swinging far south through Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, before finally reaching San Francisco. The path was nearly 2,000 miles long, about 600 miles longer than the more direct northern trails, but promised year-round communication between the coasts. The reality, though, was a gauntlet of heat, dust, and danger, especially in the heart of Apache country. John Butterfield, who had decades of stagecoach experience, knew how to run a tight operation. Still, nothing could fully prepare his team for the challenges of the Southern Overland Trail. The company divided the route into eastern and western divisions, with a key junction at Franklin, Texas, now El Paso. From there, the stages crossed some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. The Southern Overland Trail soon gained a reputation as the deadliest mail route in the country. The company used celerity wagons, lighter and faster than traditional stagecoaches, with canvas sides and open tops to cut weight. These wagons could cover rough ground quickly, but they left drivers and passengers exposed to the elements and to attack. Wind whipped through the open sides, and it wasn't unusual for travelers to lose hats, scarves, or even mail to the gusts. Passengers often complained about the dust, but for the drivers, the real threat was violence. They sat high on the box, visible targets for anyone waiting along the trail. The most dangerous stretches ran through Arizona's Dragoon Mountains and Apache Pass. Here, Chiricahua Apache warriors, under leaders like Cochise and Mangas Coloradas, watched every wagon that rattled by. The 1st and 2nd Dragoon Springs engagements in 1858 and 1859 are infamous examples. Raiders attacked stations, killed drivers, and burned supplies. Company records show at least 12 drivers and several station workers were killed in Apache attacks between 1858 and 1861. Bodies were sometimes found still clutching the reins, surrounded by spent shell casings or broken arrows. Water was life on the trail. In the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona, the company built stations every 12 to 20 miles, often at the only available springs. These oases became prime targets for raiders. At Steins Peak Station in New Mexico, for instance, station keeper Silas St. John survived an 1860 attack by barricading himself inside with a shotgun. He held out for 36 hours until help arrived, while the attackers burned the corral and poisoned the well, a common tactic to disrupt the mail line. If water ran out, the consequences were deadly for both people and horses. Sometimes, water wagons had to be sent ahead to resupply the next station, adding another layer of risk. Butterfield's company tried to minimize temptation for robbers. Official orders stated, "No money, jewelry, banknotes, or valuables of any nature will be allowed to be carried under any circumstances whatever." The hope was that raiders would leave the mail alone if there was nothing valuable inside. In practice, this policy did little to stop attacks. Raiders often broke open mailbags, only to toss aside the letters when they found no gold. The mail itself, however, was tough. Letters traveled in locked oilcloth-lined pouches that could survive rough handling and even brief exposure to fire or water. The environment was just as unforgiving as the people. In the Guadalupe Mountains of Texas, summer temperatures soared to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Drivers wrapped wet cloths around their faces to breathe during dust storms. Horses collapsed from heat exhaustion, and records from 1859 show the company had to replace more than 1,200 animals in a single year. During the winter, the southern route avoided the worst snows, but sudden cold snaps in Arizona's high desert could be just as lethal. There are accounts of drivers found frozen near Fort Bowie, their last act's attempts to light a fire with mail envelopes. Butterfield recruited most of his drivers from upstate New York, seeking experienced and cautious professionals. But even the best training couldn't guarantee survival. The Arizona stretch through Apache Pass was notorious for ambushes. Driver James Tevis later wrote that he survived one by wedging himself under the wagon, while arrows stuck in the wood like pins in a cushion. Some drivers were so young their skeletons, later found in shallow graves, showed they were still in their teens, hired for their lightweight and stamina. Passengers faced their own trials. The Butterfield service ran day and night, with no overnight stops. People slept sitting up as the wagons rattled along, jolted awake by rough roads or sudden shouts. Food was basic: jerky, hardtack, and the occasional cup of coffee at a lonely station. The fare for the full journey from Missouri to California was $200, a huge sum at the time, but there were no refunds for lost baggage or lost lives. Some surviving wagons have scratch marks inside, where terrified passengers clawed at the wood during attacks. The company's relationship with local tribes was complicated. Some Apache bands tolerated the mail line, seeing trade opportunities. Butterfield hired Pima and Maricopa men as scouts, paying them in rifles and supplies. In the Jornada del Muerto stretch of New Mexico, Mescalero Apache guides helped the stages avoid dry wells and quicksand, sometimes saving entire wagon trains after flash floods. But when Butterfield's crews cut down mesquite trees to build stations in 1859, the Tohono O'odham retaliated by burning several outposts. Despite the dangers, the Butterfield Overland Mail Company had a remarkable record. Out of 620 completed trips, only 2 wagons were lost entirely, and over 30,000 letters made it through. The company boasted a 95% delivery rate, even with the constant threat of attack, extreme weather, and unforgiving terrain. Surviving envelopes sometimes bear handwritten notes like "carried by Butterfield" as a badge of honor. Archaeological digs along the old route revealed just how hard the journey was. Near Tucson, excavators found wagon parts melted into odd shapes, evidence of makeshift repairs with whatever materials drivers could find. Nearby, a graveyard contained 13 bodies, all with signs of violent death, some likely the young drivers Butterfield hired. In Oklahoma's Ouachita Mountains, wagon ruts are still visible, worn deep by thousands of desperate runs. At Apache Pass, a stone monument lists the names of drivers killed there, with the last entry simply reading "Unknown Rider, 1861. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 brought the Butterfield line to an abrupt halt. Southern states seceded, and the Confederate government seized western sections of the route. The last mailbag on the Southern Overland Trail left Missouri in March 1861 and reached San Francisco in April. Staff had only days to abandon their stations, many of which were stripped bare, their wood and metal repurposed for the war effort. Butterfield's operation shifted north to the Central Overland Trail, but the loss of the southern route and its seasoned drivers meant the service was never the same. Butterfield had actually started experimenting with iron-plated wagons in early 1861, hoping to protect drivers from arrows and bullets. Early tests showed these armored coaches could reduce deaths by more than half, but the war redirected all available metal to weapons production, ending the experiment before it could take hold. Today, fragments of the Butterfield route still mark the landscape. Some wagon ruts run more than 2 feet deep, a testament to years of relentless travel. At El Paso, a Butterfield mailbag was recovered with an arrowhead still embedded in the leather. Inside was a perfectly preserved 1859 letter. The ink faded, but the words still legible. The writer had promised to wait for her sweetheart's return. No one knows if he survived, but his letter did, carried across the continent by drivers who risked everything. The Butterfield Overland Mail Company lasted less than 3 years, but it proved that even the harshest landscapes couldn't stop determined people from connecting a nation. Every mile delivered was a battle against nature and human threat alike. And as the era of the stagecoach ended, a new kind of mail carrier was about to take flight. One who would face dangers not just on the ground, but in the sky. The early airmail pilots in the United States quickly earned a reputation for daring, and for good reason. They called themselves the Suicide Club. Between 1918 and 1926, 35 of these civilian pilots lost their lives delivering the mail, a stark reminder of just how dangerous their job was. The Post Office Department, eager to prove that mail could fly, hired adventurous men to take the controls of planes that few others wanted. These weren't decorated military aces. They were ordinary people with an extraordinary willingness to risk everything for a paycheck and the chance to be part of something new. Their work environment was as unforgiving as it gets. Pilots sat exposed in open cockpits with little protection from the elements. Their navigation tools were basic: a compass, a map, and whatever landmarks they could spot from the sky. Railroads became their guides, but when fog or storms rolled in, those tracks vanished beneath the clouds. Flying at 30 or 40 feet, with never over 100 feet forward visibility in the average fog, made a great many angels of good pilots, wrote Jack Knight, one of the most famous Airmail pilots. Many crashes happened because pilots simply didn't see the ground until it was too late. Weather was the number one enemy. Rain, snow, and wind could turn a routine flight into a nightmare. Torrential downpours blurred vision and soaked clothing, while winter storms built up ice on the wings, making the planes uncontrollable. Pilots bundled up in layers, but frostbite was common. Some described rain hitting their faces like needles at 90 miles an hour. There were stories of pilots who landed by feel alone, their eyes frozen shut by sleet. The weather could change faster than any warning could reach them, and most forced landings and crashes were blamed on sudden storms or heavy fog. The planes themselves were far from ideal. In the earliest days, pilots flew Curtiss JN-4 Jennies, old biplanes left over from World War I. By 1921, the de Havilland DH-4 became the standard airmail plane. Pilots gave them grim nicknames like flaming coffins because of their design. The fuel tank sat right between the cockpit and the engine. In a crash, the odds of fire were high. It was common for pilots to carry small hammers in their cockpits, hoping they could smash their way out if the plane ignited. Out of the original fleet, several DH-4s caught fire in flight, and the post office kept buying more simply because they were cheap and available. The pressure to keep the mail moving was relentless. Otto Prager, the second Assistant Postmaster General, was known for his strict discipline and his mantra, "Keep to the schedule, keep to the schedule." He pushed both pilots and supervisors to put the mail above all else. If a pilot refused to fly in dangerous conditions, Prager would fire him on the spot. The result was a culture where pilots felt they had to risk their lives rather than disappoint their boss or delay the mail. This attitude led to a string of accidents and a sense among the pilots that survival depended as much on luck as on skill. Competition was fierce too. Max Miller, the first pilot hired by the post office in 1918, became a legend for his reliability. He logged over 500 successful flights before disaster struck in September 1920. During a routine run, his DH-4's engine caught fire mid-air. The plane nosedived and exploded on impact, killing Miller and his mechanic instantly. Investigators couldn't even tell if the crash or the fire came first. The wreckage was so badly burned. Eddie Gardner, hired soon after Miller, was both a friend and a rival. The post office encouraged pilots to compete for speed records, hoping to prove the service's value. Gardner and Miller often raced each other between cities, shaving minutes off delivery times. Gardner's career ended after he joined a pilot strike protesting unsafe conditions. Blacklisted from the mail service, he turned to barnstorming, performing stunts at county fairs. In 1920, at the Kansas State Fair, a pair of borrowed goggles slipped over his eyes during a maneuver. The plane's controls jammed as he tried to fix them, and he crashed before he could recover. Navigation was a constant challenge. There were no radios, no navigation lights, and no reliable way to communicate with the ground. Night flights required volunteers to light bonfires along the route, spaced every few miles, so pilots could follow the glow. If a fire wasn't lit, pilots could get hopelessly lost. Some followed car headlights on highways by mistake, only realizing their error when they ran low on fuel. There's even a story of a pilot mistaking a train's flat car for an airfield and landing right on top of it. Pilots had to invent their own survival tricks. Some carried sacks of flour to toss onto landing fields. The way the flour spread told them if the ground was soft or hard, and which way the wind blew. Others flew with maps in one hand and the control stick in the other, steering with their knees. They memorized the shapes of smokestacks, water towers, and even specific buildings to make sure they were following the right route out of each city. Getting lost could mean running out of fuel in the middle of nowhere, or worse, crashing into trees or buildings. The risks weren't just in the air. Many pilots didn't survive their first year. On average, a pilot lasted about 900 flight hours before dying or quitting. Considering they often flew 50 to 60 hours a week, that meant the odds were stacked against anyone who stayed long. Some pilots who crashed in remote areas had to wait days for rescue, surviving on whatever they could find. There are accounts of pilots boiling water with stuffing from mailbags just to stay alive. Mechanical failures were common. The planes were patched together nightly by mechanics using whatever spare parts were on hand. Wings warped in humidity, control wires snapped from metal fatigue, and engines sometimes failed without warning. One crew even carved a replacement propeller out of oak when the original broke, just to get a plane back in the air for another mail run. Sometimes accidents had no clear cause. A well-maintained plane could suddenly go into a fatal spin, possibly because of carbon monoxide fumes in the cockpit, or simple pilot exhaustion. The danger became routine. New pilots often witness fatal crashes during their first week. Some routes, like the stretch between Chicago and Cleveland, became notorious for frequent accidents, earning nicknames like Bone Valley. Pilots coped with the stress through dark humor, joking about which route would get the next newcomer. Families worried constantly. Newspapers reported every crash, and parents wrote desperate letters to the post office, begging them to stop sending their sons into the sky. The department responded by raising pilot pay to $3,600 a year, 3 times the national average. But this only attracted more risk-takers. Many of whom burned out from the constant fear and stress. The pilots' legacy wasn't just in their courage. Their sacrifices forced the post office and the growing aviation industry to adopt new safety measures. Parachutes, better maintenance routines, and improved navigation equipment all came about because so many male pilots died without them. The original Airmail routes eventually formed the backbone of the country's commercial airline network. Some artifacts from this era still exist. Museums display melted wristwatches stopped at the moment of impact, battered mailbags with claw marks from desperate pilots, and even a wallet with a train ticket that was never used. These relics are silent witnesses to the risks early airmail pilots faced every day. Modern pilots who fly replica DH-4s for air shows often remark on how difficult the planes are to handle. The controls are sensitive and require constant attention, even in good weather. Imagine flying one of these, reading a map, dodging storms, and trying to spot landmarks, all while knowing that a single mistake could be your last. For the members of the Suicide Club, danger was part of the job description. Their contracts made it clear that flying the mail was potentially hazardous to life. Many were veterans of World War I who thought mail flying would be safer than combat, only to discover that peacetime skies could be just as deadly. Every flight was a gamble, and every safe landing felt like a small victory. The last of these pioneers, Dean Smith, retired in 1953, long after commercial aviation had taken over. He once said that the original mail pilots weren't especially brave. They were just determined to prove that airmail could work. The 35 pilots who lost their lives helped build a system that now delivers mail safely across the world. Their story is a testament to what people will risk to connect others, even when the odds are against them. But while the pilots themselves were fearless, the planes they flew were another story. The next chapter in the history of airmail reveals why so many of these early aircraft earned a reputation as flying coffins, and how the design flaws of the era made every flight a new test of survival. Early airmail pilots didn't just face danger from the skies. They had to trust their lives to planes that were never meant for the job. The Curtiss JN-4 Jenny is a perfect example. Originally built as a World War I trainer, the Jenny struggled with a 90-horsepower engine that could barely keep it aloft. After the war, the post office picked up hundreds of surplus Jennies for about $500 each. These planes could carry only 300 pounds of mail, less than most people's checked luggage today. Pilots knew the risks. The Jenny's wooden frame warped in wet weather, and its fabric skin tore easily in high winds. Engine failures were common, and there were stories of wings collapsing mid-flight after a rainstorm. Mechanics stripped out anything extra to save weight, including altimeters and even some control instruments. Pilots often judged their altitude by counting fence posts as they came in for a landing, and a post office memo once insisted, "Men familiar with routes require no fancy dials." Upgrading to the de Havilland DH-4 in 1921 didn't solve the problem. It created new ones. The DH-4 had a bigger, more powerful Liberty engine, which allowed it to haul more mail, but the cockpit design put the pilot in a precarious spot. The pilot's seat was sandwiched between the massive engine up front and the mail compartment right behind. In a crash, the engine often broke loose and crushed the cockpit, while fuel tanks ruptured and sprayed gasoline directly onto mailbags and the pilot. The fabric and wood fuselage could burn to the ground in under 3 minutes. It's no wonder these planes earned the nickname flying coffins. Pilots sometimes wore asbestos gloves, not for comfort, but because they'd seen what happened to colleagues whose hands fused to the controls in a fire. The mail itself didn't help. Letters were wrapped in oiled paper to keep them dry, but that made them burn easily. Packages sometimes contained things like matches or chemicals. Regulations hadn't caught up with the idea of air transport. After a series of fires and near misses, postal clerks began to inspect parcels more closely, but the main focus was still on weight, not safety. Navigation in these early planes was a guessing game. Without radios or reliable instruments, pilots followed railroad tracks during the day and bonfires at night. When clouds or fog rolled in, those familiar tracks disappeared, leaving them to guess their location by reading farm mailboxes or looking for painted town names on rooftops. Sometimes, the paint jobs were so sloppy that pilots ended up miles off course, forced to land in strange fields just to get their bearings. There's a story of one pilot who landed in a quarry after mistaking the sun's glare on the rocks for a river. A simple error with serious consequences. Weather made everything worse. The DH-4 had no de-icing system, so in winter, pilots carried mallets to break ice off the wings in mid-air. Rain soaked through the open cockpit, blurring maps and fogging goggles. Many pilots flew blind, relying on the sounds of passing trains or the shape of the land below to guide them. Turbulence could snap a wing or rip loose a control cable. One pilot's logbook ended with the unfinished line. Severe bumps, wings flapping like... The wreckage showed both wings had torn away at 5,000 feet. Attempts to improve safety often brought new problems. Moving the DH-4 cockpit further back made fire less likely, but it changed the plane's balance and made stalls more common. Adding longer exhaust pipes kept smoke out of the pilot's eyes, but the extra weight stressed the frame. Mechanics patched planes together with whatever parts were on hand. One crash report describes a DH-4 whose landing gear collapsed because the heavier reinforced frame put too much pressure on old wooden joints. Mechanical breakdowns were a daily reality. The Liberty engines lasted only about 200 hours before needing a complete overhaul. But maintenance standards varied from field to field. Inspectors found mechanics reusing worn-out spark plugs and tying frayed control cables together with string. Pilots sometimes carried spare parts in the cockpit, just in case. Fuel systems were unreliable. Gravity-fed tanks could cut out during a climb or a sharp turn. Many pilots installed glass bottles as makeshift fuel gauges. If the bottle emptied too quickly, it meant a leak or a blocked line. One pilot nearly crashed after discovering his gauge bottle had cracked and was leaking gasoline into the cockpit. Landing was never routine. The rigid, non-shock absorbing landing gear on both the Jenny and the DH-4 couldn't handle rough fields. Crosswinds could spin the plane out of control, a maneuver known as a ground loop, often leaving the plane in pieces. After one crash, a pilot wired headquarters. "Wrecked ship, send new landing gear and 500 pounds mail." The reply, 500 pounds mail dispatched. No landing gear available until Thursday. Cockpits offered no shelter from the elements. Pilots sat exposed to wind, rain, and engine fumes. Goggles fogged up in bad weather. And in winter, pilots bundled up in so many layers, they sometimes couldn't reach the controls quickly enough in an emergency. One pilot navigated through Chicago by listening for the sounds of elevated trains after his goggles iced over. Structural weaknesses haunted every flight. The wood and fabric construction meant that wing struts cracked from vibration, and control surfaces jammed when the fabric stretched in humidity. Inspectors once found termite damage in a Jenny's tail assembly, and another pilot landed safely only to discover his rudder cables had nearly sawn through the frame. Instrument failures were just as common. Compasses spun wildly near electrical wires, tachometers underreported engine speed, and oil pressure gauges sometimes showed normal even after the engine seized up. There were no real emergency procedures. Parachutes weren't issued because officials feared pilots would bail out and abandon the mail. If the engine quit, the only option was to glide down and hope for the best. Many forced landings ended in orchards, rivers, or city streets. One pilot survived a water landing because the wreckage floated long enough for help to arrive. Weather forecasts were almost useless. Pilots got updates by telegraph, but the information was often hours out of date. Some stations checked wind direction by tossing flour into the air. If it blew back, flights were delayed. Many pilots carried personal barometers, but turbulence made them impossible to read in flight. Fatigue was a constant threat. Pilots flew 14-hour shifts with little rest. One logbook showed a pilot making 18 takeoffs and landings in a single shift. After a nighttime crash, investigators found the pilot had been awake for more than 22 hours. His last entry simply read, "Too tired to write." The flying coffin nickname was well earned. Out of the first 40 DH-4s purchased, 17 crashed within a year. Most ended in fire. When the post office tried to require fireproof suits, pilots protested that the extra weight made crashes more likely. The compromise was to keep asbestos coats at airfields, which did nothing for in-flight emergencies. Despite all this, the planes kept flying. No better options existed, and private manufacturers weren't interested in building safer mail planes. When the post office finally ordered new, purpose-built aircraft in 1926, the difference was dramatic. The new planes carried 3 times as much mail and were far less dangerous. But for years, Pilots and mechanics did what they could to keep the old Jennies and DH-4s in the air, patching them together with spare parts and determination. Today, just a handful of original Airmail DH-4s survive. One at the Smithsonian still bears fire scars repaired with mismatched fabric. Another's logbook documents 300 flight hours and 17 separate crashes. A third, on display in Nebraska, hides a tangled mess of spare parts inside its restored fuselage, a testament to the improvisation that kept the mail moving. Crash reports from the era read like a litany of hazards. One describes a pilot whose seatbelt broke during a dive, forcing him to jam the controls forward with his body. Another details a plane that stalled while climbing over the mountains, its mail load improperly tied down and shifting aft. The most chilling reports are brief. Fire, no survivors, repeated dozens of times. The last original Jenny flew as a crop duster until 1938. Its final pilot refused to fly higher than 500 feet, knowing the patched-up wings wouldn't survive the strain. When the plane was retired, mechanics found wooden spars held together with baling wire and chewing gum. This was the machine that helped launch commercial aviation, a relic of a time when getting the mail through meant gambling with your life. It's remarkable that any mail arrived at all. These planes were outdated before they ever left the ground, held together by quick fixes and flown to their limits. Still, they proved that airmail could work, laying the groundwork for every air freight service that followed. The price was steep, but the letters usually made it to their destination. One salvaged mailbag tells the story best. Pulled from the wreckage of a 1925 crash, it held 300 letters, each perfectly preserved. Among them was a note from a mechanic to his brother, describing the latest safety improvements for mail planes. The letter arrived 3 weeks late, carried by train after the pilot died trying to deliver it by air. Even when the worst happened, the mail found a way through. But as the airmail service grew and the risks became impossible to ignore, change was inevitable. The next chapter in the story of airmail would bring not just new planes, but new rules, and a government determined to take control of the sky. In early 1934, a crisis erupted that would force the United States to rethink who controlled the nation's airmail, and by extension, the future of commercial flight. The Airmail Act of 1934 was not just a set of new rules. It was a direct response to a tangled mess of corporate power, government missteps, and a mail system that had become a battleground for the biggest names in aviation. The trouble started years earlier with the McNary-Waiters Act of 1930. That law allowed the post office to award airmail contracts based on economic efficiency, but in practice, it favored the largest airline holding companies. Postmaster General Walter Brown invited airline executives to a series of private meetings, later called the Spoils Conferences, where he assigned the most lucrative routes to a handful of big players. By the early 1930s, just 3 holding companies controlled the vast majority of airmail revenue, and smaller airlines were left out in the cold. Complaints of unfairness grew louder, and soon Congress launched investigations into the process. Brown's resignation followed, but the system itself stayed in place. President Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped in with a dramatic move. On February 9, 1934, he cancelled all existing airmail contracts, declaring that the public interest demanded a clean slate. The job of carrying the mail fell to the U.S. Army Air Corps, but the Army was unprepared for the challenge. Their pilots, trained for combat, suddenly faced the relentless schedules and unpredictable weather of civilian airmail routes. The winter of 1934 was one of the worst on record. Army pilots flew outdated open cockpit biplanes like the Curtiss P-1 Hawk, often without proper navigation tools or experience flying in low visibility. The results were tragic. In just a few months, there were 66 crashes and 12 pilot deaths, according to the National Air and Space Museum. Newspapers across the country reported each fatality, and the public outcry was intense. Eddie Rickenbacker, a World War I ace and airline executive, called the disaster legalized murder. The Army's failed attempt at mail delivery exposed just how much the country now depended on fast, reliable airmail, and how dangerous it could be without the right technology and training. Pilots sometimes got lost following railroad tracks that dead-ended in quarries. Some mistook the lights of grain elevators for airfields. One pilot crashed into an Oregon hillside after becoming disoriented in fog, his watch frozen at the exact moment of impact. The experiment lasted only a few months before President Roosevelt pulled the Army from the skies. Congress moved quickly to overhaul the system. The Airmail Act of 1934, passed just 4 months after the Army's withdrawal, was designed to break up the monopolies and restore trust in airmail. The Act slashed the payment rates airlines received for carrying mail, moving from a flat per-mile rate to one based on the weight and capacity of the aircraft. This change wiped out many of the smaller, less efficient airlines that couldn't absorb the drop in revenue. Larger airlines survived, but only after being forced to separate from aircraft manufacturers and holding companies. The law made it illegal for any executive to serve on the boards of both an airline and an aircraft manufacturer. The goal was clear: prevent any one company from controlling both the planes and the routes. The Act also established a new regulatory framework. The Post Office, the Department of Commerce, and the Interstate Commerce Commission now shared oversight of airmail contracts and airline operations. This marked the beginning of a more regulated era in aviation, with the government taking a much more active role in how airlines did business. The Civil Aeronautics Board, CAB, would soon emerge from this framework, further tightening oversight and standardizing safety requirements. Route redistribution was another major shift. Instead of backroom deals, routes were now awarded through open, competitive bidding. Airlines that had built their networks around specific regions suddenly found themselves flying unfamiliar cross-country paths. Early flights under the new system were often chaotic. Pilots lacked updated navigation charts and sometimes got lost, leading to delays and missed connections. Transcontinental and Western Air, TWA, for example, saw its first New York to Chicago mail flight under the new rules take more than 11 hours, almost twice as long as before. Manufacturers had to adapt quickly. The old system encouraged airlines to order custom planes from affiliated companies. Now, with those relationships banned, airlines demanded more versatile aircraft that any carrier could use. This led to the development of planes like the Douglas DC-3, which quickly became the backbone of commercial aviation. The DC-3 was the first airliner that could make money carrying passengers alone, not just mail. This shift changed the industry's focus from government contracts to the growing market for passenger service. The Airmail Act also had a big impact on labor. Before 1934, airlines often hired rookie pilots for dangerous night flights, treating them as expendable. The public's reaction to the Army Air Corps' losses changed that. Pilots began to organize, and the Airline Pilots Association, ALPA, soon won contracts that guaranteed rest periods, hazardous duty pay, and better working conditions. For the first time, pilots' families could expect compensation if something went wrong. In 1935, a pilot's widow received a $15,000 settlement under new liability rules, a landmark in aviation law. Financial oversight became much stricter. The Interstate Commerce Commission audited airline finances, looking for hidden bonuses and questionable expenses. When American Airlines tried to disguise executive bonuses as navigation research in 1936, investigators caught the deception thanks to the new documentation rules. Airlines had to hire more accountants and keep detailed records, which increased costs but also restored some public trust in the system. Safety technology advanced rapidly as a result of the crisis. The Army's disastrous stint delivering mail convinced everyone that better equipment was essential. By 1935, the government required all airmail planes to have radio direction finders, artificial horizons, and reliable altimeters, tools that had been considered optional just a few years earlier. Companies like Sperry Gyroscope saw sales of autopilot soar as airlines tried to reduce pilot fatigue and prevent crashes. These improvements soon became standard for passenger flights as well, making air travel safer for everyone. Some of the act's effects were unintended. The ban on interlocking directorates forced out many experienced executives just when the industry needed their expertise most. Aircraft manufacturers like Douglas lost valuable input from airline leaders, which slowed the development of new planes. Still, the push for standardized designs helped create a more stable, competitive market. Passenger service took off as airlines looked for new ways to make money, with airmail revenue dropping from 95% of airline income in 1933 to just 20% by 1939, according to history. Airlines began converting mail compartments into passenger cabins. American Airlines president famously quipped that they'd carry people like letters by weight and destination. The infrastructure built for airmail, routes, airports, maintenance shops, now supported a growing wave of commercial flights. The DC-3, designed in response to the new rules, became the workhorse of these early passenger airlines. The Airmail Act of 1934 also left its mark on the US military. The Army Air Corps' failure during the mail crisis led Congress to fund better training and new air bases. Many of the pilots who had flown mail routes, both civilian and military, went on to become instructors and leaders during World War II. General Hap Arnold later admitted that the harsh lessons of 1934 taught the military more about practical flying in a few weeks than years of peacetime training ever had. Artifacts from this era still tell the story. At the Smithsonian, you can see a control panel from a crashed Army mail plane. There's a space where a radio should have been, left empty because the Army didn't have enough equipment to go around. The pilot's handwritten note reads, "Directions, follow the rails. Pray for daylight." Within 5 years, every airmail cockpit was equipped with modern navigation aids, a direct result of the Airmail Act's reforms. Some reforms, though, had mixed results. While the Act was meant to break up monopolies, it actually paved the way for a few large airlines to dominate the industry after World War II. Survivors like United and American grew stronger, using the new rules and infrastructure to expand nationwide. The very concentration of power that Roosevelt hoped to prevent slowly returned, though now under stricter government oversight. By the end of the 1930s, the chaos of the early airmail era had given way to a new order. Planes were safer, pilots were better trained, and the mail moved more reliably than ever before. But the real legacy of the Airmail Act was the transformation of air travel itself. Airlines learned to value passengers as much as parcels. The routes and systems built for mail became the foundation for the modern airline industry. Revenues from carrying people soon far outstripped those from carrying letters. Looking back, the Airmail Act of 1934 wasn't just about fixing a broken mail system. It was about setting new standards for safety, fairness, and innovation in American aviation. The lessons learned, sometimes at great cost, reshaped the way people and information moved across the country. And so, with every letter that arrives safely in a mailbox today, there's a hidden story of risk, reform, and resilience, one that connects the struggles of early pilots, the bold moves of reformers, and the everyday miracle of communication. Mail delivery has always come at a cost, sometimes measured in time, sometimes in danger, and often in human lives. The story of mail isn't just about how messages moved, but about the innovation that crisis demanded, and the people who kept adapting, no matter the risks. Each leap forward, from foot couriers to airplanes, was driven by the need to connect, even when the odds were against them. Today, your mail arrives in seconds, but centuries of sacrifice made that possible. The next time you open your mailbox or refresh your inbox, remember, every message is part of a much larger story of determination and ingenuity.